Ray Salmen was 65 years old when he vanished on the 9th of June 2013 from the shores of Harrison Lake in Fraser Valley of British Columbia, Canada. Unfortunately, as is often the case with almost all of the disappearances discussed on this channel, Ray chose one of the worst possible locations he could have to vanish from. This was a very remote area. There wasn't any real civilization in the immediate proximity, no homes, just a large lake, dense forestry and wilderness. Though from Ray's perspective, none of that was really a problem for him. He had not only been to this area, but from what I'm able to ascertain, he'd been to pretty much this exact spot over 20 times over a 20-year period. So for him, this was practically just another Tuesday. He had gained an intense familiarity with this area over those years. Usually, Ray would come out to these remote locations with his wife, Daniela, and they would stay together. Sadly this time, he would disappear so thoroughly as to never be seen again while at this camp by himself without anyone else but his two dogs, Elmer and Bandit, his truck, his camper and his raft. Ray grew up in northern Ontario and was constantly out in the woods where he learned all of his outdoorsman skills. He was an avid camper, a fisherman and a hunter. Ray was a man of true experience in all of these areas and had been doing this for his entire life. He was one of those people that just had fantastic common sense in these areas, which undoubtedly was due to the knowledge passed down to him and his love of the outdoors he spent so much time in. All of these factors perhaps just make it all the more bizarre that somehow this man disappeared in the way that he did. 10 years have come and gone since that time, and still it is not known what happened to him. As you'll come to see, there is a possibility that the authorities may have known more than they were willing to let on. But for whatever reason they had, it does seem that they didn't want to clue in the public, or even the searchers weirdly. Perhaps because of how odd the whole incident was. Or they just weren't able to confirm any suspicions that they might have held privately. Now, on the 7th of June, 2 days prior to his disappearance, Ray drove down to Harrison Lake with his two dogs from his home. He came prepared for this, and with the equipment he brought, he was clearly expecting to camp there very comfortably. As well as his two best companions, as said, he had the camper, he had a fridge, an air conditioner, a furnace, hunting equipment, and so obviously the means of defending himself. His prep also extended to the water. As said, he had his raft, which was equipped with a motor, and he had a complete life jacket. Ray was a man that knew how to prepare and how to stay safe in these kinds of areas. So it really does seem as though something truly must have gone terribly wrong. What that event may have been is not known. Ray didn't actually plan to be alone for the entire time. After heading out on the 7th, which was a Friday, he had planned to come back to town to pick up one of his best friends, John Miles, on the Monday, which would have been the 10th. The pair had planned to hang out and explore old abandoned mines together, but sadly, this meetup would never take place. On Sunday afternoon, the day before John was set to join Ray, John was out working on a truck and said that he'd heard someone ejecting 3 shells in the forest, which came from the general area that Ray's camp would have been. Police investigating complaints of shots fired stumble into mystery off West Harrison Forest Service Road. Police in the Fraser Valley are asking the public to help them find a Vancouver man who appears to have gone missing from a remote campsite off Harrison Lake. On Sunday, Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers were investigating the complaints when they happened upon the seemingly abandoned campsite. What was particularly interesting about this was the nature of these shots. The reason the Royal Canadian Mounted Police got involved right at the start here was that a number of young people rushed to the police stating that the 3 shots heard earlier had been directed at their car. I believe both of the headlights had been struck. I'm not sure if it was ever confirmed as an absolute that this was Ray that did that, but I do believe that it was assumed to be related based on what people were saying. But that's strange. Ray was a responsible hunter. He knew how to handle himself and his equipment with care. So if that was Ray, what was going on? What could have possessed him to target a vehicle like that? Was he spooked for some reason? I can't imagine that was an attempt to call for help, as he knew to eject towards the sky if he needed assistance, and not randomly at someone's vehicle where someone could have been badly hurt or worse. Could he have been aiming at something else entirely, and that was an accident? It seems that there is far more to this story than just a man getting lost in the woods. Something happened, a set of circumstances that are not obvious. Also, because the headlights had been destroyed, I'm assuming it was somewhat dark at the time and they must have been switched on for Ray or whoever else to have seen them. So what does that insinuate? If it was Ray, was he associating the bright lights with a threat? We're in total speculation land, obviously, but could that mean that there may have been a separate source of light initially that he believed posed a threat to him, and then later mistook the headlights as this potentially perceived threat? Police say that so far they have been unable to find the 65-year-old. Search and rescue and a Royal Canadian Mounted Police helicopter crew have been searching since Monday. An RCMP corporal said, "We are concerned for Mr. Salmen's safety. This is a wilderness area with no formal campsites. This area is frequented by campers. We believe that he has been at this campsite since May 28th. The corporal said there is no reason to believe the complaint about shots fired is connected to Salmen or his mysterious disappearance." I'm not entirely sure what the date of the 28th of May was referring to. As far as I can tell, Ray headed up there on the 7th of June that year. Though perhaps the spot itself might have been something that Ray tended to and just kept something set up there. Or he'd set up shop initially on the 28th and then came back home to resupply. I'm not really sure on that. It's also interesting that the statement given was that there was no reason to believe that Ray and the 3 shots were connected. I say this because during the search for Ray, they had fully armed squadrons searching the forest for him. So clearly, that can't have been the complete truth there. Privately, they must have been associating the 2 events to some degree. Now, that's not to say they believed that Ray was the one who took the shots, but they had a missing man in the woods under these odd circumstances. Perhaps they believed that there was an aggressive presence in the area. None of that was ever really made clear, and they kept tight-lipped about it. The way that Ray was reported as missing was quite atypical too. Daniela stated that she got a knock on the door, and when she answered, there was an officer outside. The officer asked if Ray was home, and she said no, and then posed some return questions of her own. Such as, is something wrong, and why are you asking me that? She stated that this officer was brief and didn't really have many details to give her as to what was going on. Afterwards, she called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who were also brief, and told her that they believed Ray was missing. All I can really assume here is that after the young people in the car experienced what they had with their headlights and then they went down to the authorities, officers came and discovered Ray's campsite abandoned, and they must have found his information inside the camper, and then when they couldn't locate him, called him in as missing themselves. Even though Daniela knew how weird this was right off the bat, she wasn't too worried initially, because she knew just how skilled Ray was in the outdoors. And she knew that he knew to stay put and allow the searchers to come to him. Her first thought was that he might just have suffered an injury and was now sat beneath a tree or something similar, just waiting to be discovered. However, as time went on, this began to look like it wasn't the case at all. The search for a Vancouver senior whose abandoned campsite was found after sounds of shots rang out near Harrison Lake last weekend is growing more desperate. Raymond's camp was discovered by Mounties, responding to a call of shots fired at a remote area roughly 50 kilometres up the West Harrison Forestry Service Road Sunday night. Officers found Salmen's 2 beloved dogs in his camper, but there was no sign of the 65-year-old. Search crews have been scouring the area since Monday to no avail, and the avid camper's wife is growing anxious to hear good news. This was another sign that something terribly wrong had taken place. Ray loved those dogs, and if he was going on a hike, they would have been right there beside him. Instead, the dogs were locked inside the camper. So why would Ray exit the camper and then lock the dogs inside? I can only imagine that action was taken for their own safety. Again, did Ray believe that there was a threat present, and what might this threat have looked like? There was no evidence of animal predation nor that of foul play. The only clues were the 3 shots, though there was no further context discovered surrounding them in terms of why they happened. Speaking of which, there was a graduation party consisting of around 50 people that was taking place not too far from where Ray was camping, and I don't know this for certain, but I believe the car whose headlights were struck may have belonged to someone either going to or from the party. The people at the party had left a lot of trash behind, and weirdly, when the professional search and rescue teams arrived, instead of placing these expert trackers inside the forest to help them find Ray, instead, these searchers were told to clean up the trash. A number of the searchers called in had a lot of experience in this particular location too, so you'd have thought they might have been put to better use in helping to find Ray. When the searchers did arrive though, they noted the truck, the camper, and that all of Ray's belongings were laid out under the tarp and everything looked well maintained. Again, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police had noted that both the truck and camper were locked with both of the dogs inside the camper, but no one else was around. After being told this, it seems that Daniela did not believe that Ray would have been on a hike at the time, otherwise the dogs would have been with him. Hiking was quite literally one of the reasons he had them in the first place. He loved their company and taking them on walks. It's not clear at all why the dogs had been locked inside. I won't reiterate too much with that, other than stating the only conclusion I can reach was that Ray may have felt that there was a danger of some kind nearby. But if that was the case, then why wasn't he also in the camper? Unless this was a threat that he didn't believe the camper was enough to defend against. I say that because if it was the presence of a bear or some other kind of predator passing by, it seems to me that he would have been in the camper with them, waiting for whatever it was to leave. This didn't happen. One of the searchers stated this: "It was the strangest thing. I have never showed up to a search where we had full emergency response team members. Some guys had fully autos, and I remember it very specifically because I've never showed up to a search where we're searching alongside emergency response team members." So, I suppose one question that might be asked right off the bat would be, why was there a fully armed SWAT team presence at the site? This is odd to some extent since they were searching for a missing person, and it's not clear if they had a suspicion that they just weren't sharing. However, I can only imagine that after the incident with the car whose headlights had been destroyed, perhaps the authorities were just being careful and assumed that whoever did that may have meant harm to others. The searchers themselves knew that something was wrong with all of this, and they did think that these events were odd. And you can see why. You have professional search and rescuers arrive at the scene. These are the kind of people that know exactly what they're doing. They have tons of experience and many are great trackers. The search dog handlers know how to get the best out of the dogs, and instead of making them an integral part of the search right away, they're made to clean up garbage while sending fully armed squads into the woods. What were they expecting to have happen or find in the woods? Some kind of potential conflict or standoff or what? That's all you can really conclude with that, but it's interesting that they didn't specifically tell the searchers this. It's all these mysteries. My mind keeps thinking what could have possibly happened that he would go without the dogs. What would he be doing that he doesn't have the dogs with him? If he's going for a hike, he would take the dogs. He's camped all his life, always. He's more at home in the bush. Now that the weather's changed, it's cold, it's raining, and it's kind of scary now. It's hard to be positive now. Days after Ray vanished, the weather suddenly took a turn for the worse. meaning that hopes of finding him safe had dwindled. The authorities stated that at the time, he may have gone out to practice his aim, became injured in the process, and was now unable to communicate with them. It really does seem like they weren't being completely open about it because they were sending in fully armed squads. Their hypothesis quickly shifted though. A man who went missing while camping near Harrison Lake is presumed to have drowned, and the focus of the search efforts has shifted from rescue to recovery. For context, the search and rescue professionals had now entered the search and began their grid searches. But I believe that they were told not to go too far into the bush, which again they found odd. By means of an aerial search, Ray's clothing and belongings were spotted at a beach, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police went in to retrieve them. Upon their return, they had the items, but apparently told the searchers that it was not worth going in any further as it's unsearchable. This left searchers puzzled again, because it seems that they knew that wasn't completely true. It's not clear to me now, or obviously the searchers back then, what the Royal Canadian Mounted Police's motivations were with that instruction. In the afternoon of June 13, RCMP Air Services saw balloons at a secluded beach approximately 400 metres north of his campsite. Ground teams found clothing and spent shell casings. Their conclusion was that Ray may have been hurt, but because of cliffs and rocky outcrops, couldn't get off the beach. They theorise he ejected shells trying to get someone's attention. At someone's car, really? For additional context, the helicopter spotted Ray's backpack, some clothes folded beneath a log, and his hunting equipment. Quite a distance away from this area, and sometime at a later date, I believe, his sidearm would be found laying in a meadow. Clearly, something odd happened there. Why was the sidearm so far away from everything else, on top of a hill first of all? And secondly, despite the unusualness, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police doubled down, saying that they feel that he must have been in the water. His boat was still at the campsite, so it's not as if he'd had some kind of boating accident. And even if he'd been on the boat, his wife said that he never does so without having the life jacket on. Official conclusions seem to allude to the idea that Ray became injured and entered the water for some reason, and while trying to swim back to camp, he must have gone beneath the water and thereby passed away at some stage. It's important to note that the clothing was found 2 days into the search, and it was fairly warm at that point apparently, even at higher elevations, so it certainly seems that at that point in time, hypothermia was just completely out of the question and not a plausible reason for the removal of his clothing. A few other points of oddity. There was a large tracking dog presence, and the handlers had said that it was very unusual to find absolutely no trace at all, despite having so many of them out looking. According to Daniela, the items found and retrieved by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police were never returned to the family. I don't really understand that, especially when it comes to the backpack. That seems like it should have been returned by default. So again, what was the motivation in keeping it for themselves? The whole situation reeks from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police's perspective. It reeks of them holding some kind of an inclination or knowledge that they just didn't want to share. Was the backpack considered evidence then? And if so, evidence of what? In the end, it also seems like the Royal Canadian Mounted Police changed their stance on the headlights situation too. The Mounties believed Ray drowned sometime after going on a hike high up in the bush above his campsite and injuring himself. Somehow, the mishap left him trapped on a small beach wedged along the shore's steep terrain. Unable to climb out, he took off his boots, socks and pants and likely tried to swim around a rocky bluff to another clearing but slipped under the surface. There very well may have been a fall of some kind, but I agree with the assessment by Daniela that if he was hiking, then the dogs would have been with him. So if he did feel the need to get to higher ground, just what was going on? Whether he fell off a cliff or climbed down, we don't know, said a Royal Canadian Mounted Police corporal. Before Ray entered the water, police believe he was in such distress that he ejected 6 shells. His younger brother, Bob, a fellow hunter, said it was common for salmon to carry in the wilderness in case of a run-in with a bear or another wild animal. One of the 6 smashed the headlights of a Nissan Pathfinder, some 500 metres away and directly in sight of the small beach. Another 2 struck the side of a camper in a neighbour's campsite. So at this point, that and the disappearance itself were now being viewed as connected. Though police ruled out foul play, Ray's brother and Otto, who also visited the campsite Saturday, mulled over other scenarios when they received the news. Ray has run into some strange people here, said Otto, before Bob picked up the story. Yeah, Bob said. A few years ago, some armed people were up here and they threatened to take his boat and everything. He ended up staying in the bush all night with the means of defending himself. If Ray had been injured by another person, it seems that you might have expected to see evidence of that near to where his items were found. Though in that scenario, I suppose Ray entering the water also might have made sense if he felt that it was his only means of escape. Though on that point, it is important to note that the lake had been searched many times without finding him, including the use of robotic submersibles. For me, the key lies in the fact that Ray locked the dogs inside the camper, and that his sidearm had just been dropped and abandoned on the top of a hill. I personally believe he locked those dogs away for good reason, though I don't know what that reason was. It just seems to me that an event completely out of his control took place that night. Now, what that event might have been, I have no idea. Despite 10 years passing now, Ray has never been found. I've pretty much exhausted all of the material I could find at this point, so it seems that now would be a good time to hand it over to you in the comments below. Why was his sidearm abandoned such a long distance away from everything else at the top of a hill? What do you think happened here? I'd just like to take the time to thank you for watching, and a big thank you to the patrons who've been running around on the screen. If you found the video interesting, then please do leave a like, hit the bell and subscribe if you haven't already, it helps me a lot. If not, then feel free to leave a dislike, I'm just looking for your honest opinion either way. I hope that you've had a great day or evening depending on where you are, and I'll see you in the next one. Be safe guys, peace.